And then, Jen, I'll pass it over to you to take us along a great journey.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Dana. And so we decided to record because some people are at very awkward times who wanted to come. So I think it's too early in the morning for them. Is that right? And so we'll record and share. And so we'll welcome everybody who's here and everyone who is joining us later as we share the recording. So just so people here know, we will record this session, but we won't, and we'll probably just record the whole thing, but we won't include um, your voices unless you want us to in what's shared. So maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation about that later. Um, and yeah, just welcome to everyone. I think people are introducing themselves in the chat. It's really nice to see people, nice to see familiar faces and new names. So it's yeah, I'm happy to be here. So I'm happy in lots of ways to be here, but one of the ways is that um, this sort of speaks to my heart because I have done a lot of work in both Indigenous health data, data governance, data sovereignty, and in aging and dementia related work. So this is one of those very unique spaces where the work in both of those spaces comes together. So I'm happy to be here to present. I think this is the third of our new webinar series for IIDRN. I guess it's the 23rd here. I should have probably put that it's also the 24th. For some people, I'm looking at you, Kylie. Welcome. So I'm Jen Walker. I'm Mohawk and Wolf Clan, member of Six Nations of the Grand River. I work as a professor at McMaster University, and as Dana mentioned, I'm the co-chair for the IIDRN Executive Committee, which is a small group of dedicated people who meet every month to try and set some direction for IIDRN, have introduced these webinars, who help support planning for the conference. So happy to be here. Thanks. So I'm coming to you from the territory of that is covered by this wampum that's on this screen. So this wampum belt is a wampum that signifies the dish with one spoon. It's often referred to as a dish with one spoon or the dish treaty. And it's an agreement between Haudenosaunee peoples, of which my community is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Anishinaabe peoples. And I've seen people introducing themselves as Anishinaabe. This territory where I am in Hamilton, Ontario, is the territory that is shared through that treaty, the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And this image here up in the top left of the screen is the Grand River. And so my community is Six Nations of the Grand River. And so the agreement for land with the federal government in Canada is that there was a tract of land on either side of the Grand River from the beginning to the end of it. Right now, if you know this land, you would know that there's cities that are not the First Nation community that are now on some of that land, but the Six Nations of the Grand River still in that territory. I don't, oh, it's not running. Oh, maybe I have to do this to, oh, okay. So this was, I was thinking not long ago about how I was speaking to a group of students and we were talking about sort of like when you have a path in front of you, that you're walking on that path and someone else has beaten down that path and it makes it easier for you to walk. So this is a picture on the left, a picture where from family property. So it's our property in Muskoka in Bracebridge, Ontario, and there's like 155 acres that we have that we use in the forest, and this beaver pond actually that's frozen in the winter. And always in the winter, it's a very hard slog to get through that path. But once we've broken it down, it gets easier and easier and easier to walk. So we were talking about that, and talking about how the students were reflecting with me, and they were like, yeah, people always say that, but that means it should be easier for us, but somehow it's not. We end up having to also come to the end of the path you have tread and then keep slogging, right? And so that's this image of my beloved puppy who passed away about a year and a half ago. So it's not raw, don't worry, but she used to always take the path ahead and we would be able to follow behind her. And it really was making me reflect on how, with this, I was preparing for a talk on data sovereignty at a conference called Powering Up Data Sovereignty. And it was for the Chiefs of Ontario, and it was all First Nations invitees. And we were talking about First Nations data sovereignty in Ontario, in one province in Canada. And I was just reflecting on how, I feel like I've been slogging on this path for a long time. And then, but then really, like, other people are now coming to the end of that path and pushing forward in brand new ways, in brand new directions that that we'll have yet to see what happens. And so when you think about the path to Indigenous data sovereignty, it hasn't actually been that long that we have been trudging this specific path, but we've come to the end of a lot of other paths around sovereignty, self-determination, and the rights of Indigenous peoples, and being able to kind of move it forward in data sovereignty. Now we're in an environment where so much of our research data is being expected to being put in open data platforms and data deposits. We're thinking about the context of artificial intelligence in data and research. And so we can't just stay on the path we've always tread. We really have to keep treading a new path. So I'll come back to this sort of metaphor in the future, but just really thinking about how far we've come, but how much further we have to go. So I'm going to start getting into the content by defining. I'm balancing, like, looking at you and looking at the slides. Anyway, by defining a little bit about what Indigenous data means. And for many of you, this will be something you already know, but I need to put it into context because our research can be quite diverse. Like, when we think about Indigenous data, we also are not just thinking about research. But if we think about the context of data being about individuals, that might include administrative data, social information about demographics, health, employment, education. So sometimes that data comes into research, and sometimes it's collected for the purpose of research. The second column there is data about collectives and communities, including Indigenous peoples or nations' traditions, cultural practices, language systems, and ancestral knowledges. And then data about non-human relations, including knowledge that describes land management, history, geology, animals and wildlife, water, plants, and ecosystems. So when I'm in spaces collaborating with colleagues in Indigenous data sovereignty scholarship, people are thinking about all these kinds of data. People are thinking about all this kind of knowledge when they're thinking about Indigenous data. For the purposes of our conversation about dementia research, I'm going to acknowledge that we have all these kinds of data, that in our dementia research, we may be having data about all these different kinds of things. But I'm going to focus mainly, for the purposes of this conversation, on data about individuals. So about people. And so I just don't want you to think that that's all that we talk about in the Indigenous data sovereignty field. but that's what I'm going to focus on today. So, thinking about Indigenous identity and identification of Indigenous people, that can show up in research data in lots of different ways as well. It can show up through, there's probably more ways than this, but these are the ones that I usually come across in my research as an epidemiologist and community-based researcher. I know those things don't usually come together, but they do in very sometimes very clash-y ways in my brain, but they do come together eventually. So we find self-identifiers, so where people have an opportunity to identify themselves as an Indigenous person in geographic location data. So sometimes, particularly, in Canada, for example, we have First Nation communities where almost everybody living in the community is a First Nations person. We can identify people sometimes by the services they access. So if it's an Indigenous specific service, health service, Indigenous specific education program, accessing Indigenous services that are provided through an Alzheimer's society, those kind of services could, by looking at just that population, you could be sometimes inadvertently actually identifying Indigenous people. And then the last way is a linkage to some kind of registry or citizenship information. For us in Canada, sometimes that's the people who hold a card that says they're a registered Indian with the federal government. Sometimes it's like a list from the community or it's saying that these people are the registered citizens of this nation. So when you're linking data or you're using that data to sample from, then you know you've got Indigenous people who are citizens of Indigenous nations. So those are some of the ways that the data show up. But the more interesting question is why they show up. Why do we see Indigenous data coming into research and into dementia research? So why are researchers even collecting data about Indigenous identity while they're doing their work? So many people here are probably collecting Indigenous identity, and I know why I do it, but I've also learned that there's many other motivations and reasons for collecting Indigenous data. So one that I'm, trying to learn a little bit more about and trying to basically come to some understanding of the motivation is to ensure equity and inclusion in dementia research. So many times people come to the conversation saying, we're doing drug research. We're doing this research, or we're doing biomarker research. We're doing these big, huge studies, and Indigenous people are underrepresented in that research. And so we're not sure how well that Indigenous, whatever comes from this research applies to Indigenous populations. So that is a motivation that people have. They want to make sure they're not trying to answer questions about Indigenous people. They're not trying to answer questions about equity of access or anything like that. They just want to make sure Indigenous people are in the research and not being systematically excluded. So they're not even really intending to report on Indigenous data. They just want to make sure Indigenous people are in. The second one is research. People want to collect information about Indigenous identity to answer an equity related research question. So that might be a situation where they think that people are they want to explore whether Indigenous people are getting equal treatment, whether they're the quality of care provided, the quality of access to supports and services, those kinds of things. So it's more of an equity related research question that requires the need for Indigenous data. And then the last one is where I mostly live, which is to support Indigenous self-determination in dementia research and care. So it's about Indigenous communities having data having information, doing research to answer their own questions, to be able to define their own pathways to dementia supports and care, and do their own advocacy. So uh, just write in the chat if you have a different, like there's some kind of other motivation you're seeing that I'm not seeing. But in the times when I've been supporting researchers who are curious about doing health research in general and want to include Indigenous people in their research, they seem to fall into these categories. So nobody's putting anything in the chat, I don't think, or putting up their hand, but please do if you want to stop me. Maybe like, is there something in the chat? Okay,
Nope.
just everyone's just getting welcomed. Okay.
You've covered it out everything.
Okay, I've covered everything so far. Done. No, but what I want to say next is, okay, so I said this is the most interesting question, the motivation. I'm so curious about people's motivations when they're trying to include Indigenous identity. Maybe I could answer, maybe I could include a last one about how sometimes epidemiologists want to access Indigenous identity so they can control for it. But that one just makes my stomach turn, so I'm not even going to talk about it because that's a no. So what I think here is that's an interesting question. I'm very curious about why people want to collect Indigenous identity because it might determine a little bit about the kinds of relationships they need to have and what they plan to do with the data. But doesn't matter why. It can be any of these reasons. And as soon as you have Indigenous data, it requires you ethically as a researcher to be working in ways that support Indigenous data sovereignty. So even if your research question and your motivation for collecting Indigenous data is not about self-determination and sovereignty, the result of collecting the data means you have to be on a path of honoring Indigenous voice and self-determination in your project, at least in how you manage the data, access the data, and report on the data. Okay? So internationally, there is, and I'm so happy that one of my other colleagues who works in this sort of international space is also on the call here. Indigenous data and working in collaboration with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. I have a little, the website for the Global Indigenous Data Alliance comes at the end of the presentation, but through that Global Indigenous Data Alliance, there are several of us who've been involved over time. Thank you, Robin. The Indigenous data sovereignty movement really is an international movement. So Indigenous data sovereignty refers to the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. And data sovereignty is not just a right or coming with that right, it's also our collective responsibility as Indigenous peoples to be governing our data. So the Indigenous data sovereignty refers to rights. And data that support Indigenous sovereignty, so it's just another way of thinking about it. But if you have data that are supporting Indigenous sovereignty, they are owned, controlled, and accessed and possessed by Indigenous nations. They are used in ways that are guided by Indigenous knowledges. So it goes beyond the actual governance and rules about who can access and use the data. It also involves the ways that they are used and that the ways that the data are used are guided by Indigenous knowledges, and that the data accurately reflect Indigenous experiences and promote intergenerational healing. And I would say that you can probably all imagine data sets that have Indigenous data within them, maybe research data sets, maybe program data sets. And even if there's some kind of agreement that ensures that the access to the data is controlled by Indigenous communities or nations, they aren't always used in ways that are guided by Indigenous knowledges. So then they then that data is lacking in its ability to support Indigenous sovereignty. So you might have Indigenous governance, but it's not actually supporting Indigenous sovereignty. And then that last point there about reflecting Indigenous experiences and promoting intergenerational healing, there are a lot of data sets that are owned, controlled, accessed, and possessed by Indigenous nations and are used in ways that are guided by Indigenous knowledges, but are really missing an accurate reflection of Indigenous experiences. So, for example, in Ontario, the province that I live and work in, we have the health services research for the province is held in data sets that are used by tons of researchers and scientists to answer questions about the health of the healthcare system and the health of people living in Ontario in general. We have systems and governance in place to make sure that First Nations data are only accessed in a way that is owned, controlled, and possessed by First Nations. And their applications process makes sure that the data are used in ways that are guided by their knowledges and experience. But the data are hospital data. They're missing all sorts of aspects of our community experiences and don't promote intergenerational healing. So if we can think about the ultimate data, it's data that does all three of these, but all knowing that, we're working with what we have and we're all doing our best. But this is the ideal in my mind. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I think, you can tell me in the chat if the country you live in has not signed on to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I know it took a long time for Canada to do so, but that Canada has now, and it's quite complex. But what I want to say is that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People actually guides that conversation around Indigenous data sovereignty, because right in it, it's the right to self-determination, the right to making sure that our diversity of cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations are appropriately reflected in education and public information, that collectively we have rights to determine and develop priorities and strategies and administer programs through our own institutions. All of these things support Indigenous data sovereignty. And then that last one, the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop intellectual property. So there is international grounding for this. And sometimes I remember early on in conversations, we have a lot of tools in Canada we can draw on. We have First Nations have asserted a set of data governance principles called OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession of data. But what was happening elsewhere was that people were facing the conversation. Well, if we do this for First Nations, or if we do this for Indigenous people, then we'll have to do it for every special group. So we just can't. We can't do Indigenous data sovereignty because then we'd have to do it for every special group. But what UNDRIP helps us to explain is that these are actually rights that are distinct and unique to the Indigenous people of the place where the work is happening. So anytime there's conversations that are kind of, people are not ready for that Indigenous sovereignty or self-determination conversation, and they're stuck in this sort of equality conversation, then pulling out some conversations about rights and distinct rights is sometimes helpful. Okay, so we've talked about Indigenous data sovereignty, which is rights-based. It relies on Indigenous data governance to be able to enact it. Indigenous data governance relies on two things, okay? Indigenous data governance is two things at the same time. It is Indigenous governance of Indigenous data, which is often what we talk about when we think about Indigenous data governance. We think about who says what can be accessed and how, and who makes decisions about the data. That's Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. But what we also need to have in place are strong processes to support Indigenous use of Indigenous data for governance. If you only have half of it, you don't actually have Indigenous data governance. So if you only have a group in place to say yes or no, that's not enough for Indigenous data governance. That second part of Indigenous use of Indigenous data for governance is really important. It's also really hard. The first part is hard too, but the second part is really hard. So when I think about, I mean, I've been part of other people's projects. I can think of one specifically where there's a whole group of communities whose data are included in this big research project that includes biomedical data, includes like diagnostic imaging. So there's several First Nation communities included. They decide who uses the data for what, but they never decide how to use the data for their own decision making. The mechanisms for that are not in place. So the project has done a pretty good job of making sure that there is Indigenous governance of the Indigenous data in the research project, but they've done a really poor job of the second part. It took me a while to figure out what all the barriers were. Part of it is helping people understand what is possible with data. So as researchers, sometimes that's our job. Sometimes we come in not just to make sure that there's data governance agreements, but also to make sure that everyone is equipped to be able to use the data to answer their own questions and support it to be able to do that. There's Robin. Robin, you knew your picture was going to be in here somewhere. So this was actually a wonderful opportunity that Robin and I had. You see we're side by side there. To be in Botswana when a really important conversation was happening. We were at a meeting of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance before, I think before it was even called that. We were at this meeting, which was the Research Data Alliance conference. And what was happening at the conference is there was a lot of profile given to the FAIR principles. These principles that data should all be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That's FAIR. Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So the idea was that data should be collected once and reused many times in an open science way so that, it sort of democratizes data in a lot of ways. That's how people were talking about it. So we, a small group of Indigenous researchers who had gathered at this conference, said, well, that might be wise in the overall use of data, but when they're Indigenous data, there's other considerations. So there's another image where it says, I can't remember, it's like be fair and care. So the care principles came into being at this conference. We sat around drafting them, and this was the beginning of the conversation around care. So you will maybe see these around, and in some geographic areas around the world, they play a bigger role than others. Here in Canada, the care principles are really hopefully intended to drive people to local data governance and specific distinct data governance principles. So it doesn't supersede OCAP, for example, for First Nations. So there might be local data governance and community-specific data governance principles. But in the absence of that, in an open science kind of world, we want to make sure that Indigenous data are used in ways that respect collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So these are some of the details of what is embedded in the care principles. And you can find the care principles published at the reference below, but also at the GIDA website. A lot of these things are like literally screenshots from the GIDA website. So one of the things that came from that work there's actually a whole bunch of things that have come from that work. One of them is, thanks, Robin. One of them is actually like a little bit of this kind of breaking out of the people's rights to use data for governance and to have governance of data. So it breaks that equation apart that I was showing you, where I was saying that Indigenous data governance involves both the governance of data and data for governance. So I would say that these are other ways to help in the conversations around rights and responsibilities for data. So we've chatted through Indigenous data sovereignty, relying on strong Indigenous data governance. We talked about a couple of sets of principles to guide that, and the need for both governance of data and using data for governance. All of that needs to be supported in research by strong research data management plans. Now, just give me a quick sense of how many people are being mandated now to have research data management plans in your research. I'm now looking at the screen to see if people are thumbs upping or anything. In Canada, this has come. We have to have research data management plans if we are funded through our federal funding agencies for our research. And starting in I think pilot, but anyway, starting in 2027, there will be an expectation that most research data is actually put into data depositories. So we're working through this as Indigenous researchers. And what I want to say is, in our case in Canada, Indigenous data sovereignty is being respected in those policies. So Indigenous data can be exempt from that data deposit requirement. But there is no reason not to have a research data management plan, a strong research data management plan. Having that as part of your toolkit in a research project is so helpful. So if you have your proposal to draw on, then like once your project gets started, one of the first things to start thinking about is how data collected or accessed in your project is going to be managed. And there's really key questions to be asking. Part of it is really working closely. Now I'm like, definitely you'll see my bias in that I intend for all research about Indigenous people to be used in a way that is to support Indigenous self-determination rather than, the equity and inclusion kind of approaches. But if we have strong Indigenous data governance on research projects, it necessarily shifts us from using data to shine lights on problems to Indigenous peoples using data to find and guide a path forward. So it's this analogy of like, instead of it being like a flashlight that where you can just, it's like trying to find the problem, and you're shining a light on a problem in a community. It's the community using that flashlight to guide a way towards healing. And so having those strong Indigenous data governance pieces in place means that even if your project is about the worst deficit you can imagine, the biggest problem, and right now for me, honestly, dementia feels like world's biggest problem. I'm supporting family members. Right now it's like all in my personal life, it's all in my professional life. Dementia feels like a big, big problem. And it's not that I don't want to shine a light on that. It's not that I don't want to shine a light on the challenges of caregiving. It's not like I don't want to shine a light on all of the all of the really big like every week feels like a big moment for our family right now because of dementia in our lives. So it's not to say that there's not problems. What it means is that we're using that data in a strengths-based way to move forward as a collective to improving things. So when you have strong Indigenous data governance, you don't fall into the trap of just doing reports or publishing papers that don't go far enough to using data to find solutions. So making sure that you have effective Indigenous data governance in your projects can involve lots of different things. So we research data management plans might be accompanied by formal and legal data agreements. So sometimes it has to be data sharing agreements between, community organizations and institutions, like for actual sharing of data and really spelling out, like not being afraid of that like formal agreement. At the same time as balancing that with ethical relationships, because these ethical relationships will support you through so many pitfalls in establishing formal and legal data agreements. So I just started with lots of people on this call, actually, a big national project about a year and a bit ago, looking at brain health assessment and holistic approaches to brain health assessment. We spent the entire first year, zero planned data collection on building ethical relationships, establishing our grounding and our relationality with each other across 5 different Indigenous community-based research sites, and the development of policies to guide our way of working together, including data management. So the investment of time into the relationships and the agreements is worth it, because then when things get rocky, as they always do, then you have a grounding for having a conversation. You've already talked about so many things. The values, the expectations are already out there. I'm going to go a little faster. I'm going to get to these slides because I just looked at the clock and I was like, oh, I said I wasn't going to talk for an hour. Nobody believed me. I know that. It's okay. So just going from principles to practice, it's going to be a little bit of repeating. And this is the summaries. So we need an acknowledgement and a commitment to sovereignty of the rights holders. It doesn't matter why the data is being collected. You acknowledge the sovereignty of the rights holders and the nations. You build you build on strong established relationships, or you start relationships that need to be built before any data is discussed even. It has to have the right people having the right conversations. So having this sort of like, well, I know somebody there, so it's going to be okay, or like it's a lot of conversations with many people to think about how data needs to be governed in a project. In Canada, for sure, and this might be the case other places, we have to be thinking about distinctions-based approaches. We have so many diverse Indigenous perspectives. I was just in meetings this week with the urban Indigenous communities plus the First Nation communities in this region of Southern Ontario. That includes Hamilton, Brantford, Niagara. Like it's the small region. The number of diverse Indigenous perspectives on governance in our city, basically, is really intense. And to make sure that we're doing Indigenous data governance in a way that doesn't interfere, so that ensure non-interference with existing Indigenous governance relationships, so that we're governing data in the cities from the hospital in ways that doesn't interfere with the First Nations communities whose members are living in the city. So there's so many layers to governance that it requires a lot of conversation and deep thinking. And we need processes to support both of those things: Indigenous governance of Indigenous data and Indigenous use of Indigenous data for governance. Some of the questions that that will help to guide that beginning part are listed here. So thinking about who is reflected in the data and how are relationships being strengthened and maintained through the project. So there's so many ways that projects can undermine relationships, but how can those relationships actually be strengthened by the research? What data governance principles do the rights holders uphold to support data sovereignty? And so that in some places might be very clear, and in some places might need some development, actually, and testing and thinking and using models from different places and seeing what fits. Very important is about capacity. So what collective capacity needs to be developed to support? And so this was the reference I was giving to the big project that has great Indigenous governance of Indigenous data, but hasn't spent the effort to develop the capacity for Indigenous use of the data for decision making. And then how do the rights holders want to be responsible for setting priorities with the data, for determining access to the data, for interpreting and reporting on Indigenous data? And how do we manage breaches and slip-ups? These are guiding questions to think, and obviously public health wasn't meant to be in there, but it's guiding questions to think about as we think about building these things together in research projects. I promised I would come back to this analogy. And so now my little boy, who's now 19, is added to the mix. So you can see him slogging. He's still trying to break that trail. He's still trying to, oh, the dog is realizing how tired this little boy is, and then gives him a little cuddle and then takes over. So this is the idea, right? We do need to support each other. We do need to understand that our situations are going to be different, but that we can learn from each other. We can keep that path moving through many things we're not even anticipating. Like when I started doing this work like 15 years ago, I didn't anticipate AI. Now, like every 10th discussion I'm in is about AI. And I'm just like, having to learn all new things and follow the people who now know how to lead. So I think that's the message, is that we all have a role to play. One of those hands is also Robin's. You'll remember Robin? So just to finalize, we have to think about sovereignty relationships, our Indigenous knowledges to keep the focus on strengthening past well-being. And when those things are strong, the information and support can flow more easily to support decision-making and self-determination. These are a couple of resources, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and also a pathway we developed through the CCNA, the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging. And there's 2 talks on Indigenous data sovereignty in relation to dementia data also in that pathway. So I just want to say, Nyawe, thank you so much. And we do still have some time for discussion and question.
Thank you, Jen. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to end the recording so we can just have discussion.